Great. Thank you very much to Lily for serving as the chair. Thanks a lot to Amber for discussing 5 papers. Thanks to Amber as well for having seen this as a proposal to test in 2011 or so. And I want to acknowledge too all the work of Jonathan Mummolo, my co-author, who's a Stanford University PhD student. So this presentation is entitled Assessing the Breadth of Framing Effects. And the goal is, as with many of the papers on this panel, to help think through, drill down, if you will, into the conception of framing. Now, this is no surprise to anybody in the audience. Issue framing is a central activity that political actors are engaged in. Indeed, one of the main things that political actors do on a day-to-day basis is appear on television, speak to TV and to newspaper reporters to try to offer frames, right? To present current events and political issues in certain ways. And specifically what they're trying to do strategically is to highlight the favorable aspects of a given issue, right? To highlight the aspects of an issue that will portray their side in the best light and lead people's opinions to be favorable towards their viewpoint. Now, it's not just politicians who are preoccupied with framing effects, but also political science. In the last, in the 4 years between 2010 and 2015, there were no fewer than 46 articles on framing in the 3 leading general interest journals in political science, right? So this is one of the major, the concept of framing is one of the major issues in political science in recent years. That said, there are still ongoing conceptual debates in political science and in communication about what exactly we mean by framing and how we should use the term, how we should distinguish among different types of framing, right? And there are debates as well about and discussions about what's the mechanism that is thought to underpin framing, right? For example, we typically define framing as making selective cognitive considerations either accessible or applicable, right? It may be that when I'm exposed to a frame, say about terrorism, that what that does is it makes specific considerations in my mind accessible so that I can access them and use them in the formation of an opinion. Or it may make them applicable, that is, it may help me apply them to the task of developing an evaluation, right? Now that said, there's one element of framing effects that I think we've explored very little to date, and that is the question of how broad the set of accessible considerations the set of considerations that are made accessible by framing is, right? So put differently, we know that framing makes a set of considerations accessible in people's minds, but just how broad is that set? I actually think that question has real implications, right? If I expose you to a frame about anti-terrorism policy, and it's associated with one of the 2 political parties, it's possible that that frame might make accessible for you a whole set of partisan considerations, right? Some considerations that are related to terrorism, but some considerations that may be related to healthcare, to the financial stimulus, or to a wide range of other issues. That would be a broad, in that case, we would think of the framing effect as being very broad, right? Activating a wide range of considerations. What I want to focus on here then is this question of breadth or spillover, which to date really has gotten very little attention from framing, but is very important in separating framing effects from priming or other related kinds of cognitive and communications processes. So here's an example of 12 highly cited articles, or they're all articles, no books, that look at framing over the last couple decades, and what you can see is that with just one exception, none of them consider spillover, right? So they're all focused on dependent variables that are in the same domain as the original frame, and that makes sense. The one exception to this, the Druckmann and Bolson piece, they look both at carbon nanotubes and genetically modified food, and there they're considering spillover just as a kind of nuisance to be avoided, and not as something as a substantive process of interest, right? So while we've done a tremendous number of framing studies in recent years, we actually know very little about the extent to which framing effects spill over. That if I were to provide a frame on fiscal stimulus, is that going to spill over and influence attitudes in unrelated or in only tangentially related areas? So my goals for this talk are to explain why the breadth of framing effects matters theoretically, to briefly outline the research design that we employ to assess framing, highlight a few key findings, and then suggest what I think these results mean more generally for the study of public opinion and also issue constraint. So, as I started to say, issue framing is thought to operate through both cognitive accessibility and applicability, right? These are 2 different processes through which a communication may come to shape my evaluation of some policy or some other object, right? But the outstanding question here is just how broad is the set of considerations that are made accessible, right? We commonly say framing makes a subset of considerations accessible and applicable, but just how broad is that set, right? Depending on that, framing effects might have a tremendous influence on public opinion. Say if I effectively frame healthcare reform in certain ways, that might spill over into people's assessments of whether the government should be engaged in, providing food stamps, for example. Or if framing effects are very broad, political candidates might well have an incentive to focus on specific issues, knowing that their frames on those issues are going to carry into opinion on a wide range of other issues, right? That said, as we saw, most of our empirical evidence focuses really only on framing effects in pretty specific domains, right? Now that said, there's a rich and long-standing set of psychological theories which suggest that our minds are not neatly organized by political issues, which will be no surprise to many of you, right? And that the cues or frames generally can activate a wide network of associations that's well beyond the original domain, right? That if I start talking about the moon, I might activate associations with the detergent Tide, even though the moon is quite distinctive from the detergent Tide. Not only that, but there's been a more recent strand of literature, largely in psychology, arguing that metaphors to a powerful degree can structure human cognition, right? That we actually think to an important extent metaphorically. And if that's true, it may well be that frames on specific issues may influence structurally or metaphorically similar issues. And we'll see some evidence on that question soon. So the challenge, though, that a lot of the recent framing literature has faced, which has been raised in a couple of recent pieces, when we see framing effects, right? When we expose people to a frame or not, we're doing multiple things. We're providing them not only with a frame, but also with information, potentially with partisan cues. So how do we know in many of our framing experiments that we've really isolated framing as opposed to some other cognitive process, right? And here we'd argue studying the breadth of framing can help us illuminate the mechanisms and can distinguish, is this really framing as classically construed, as opposed to the priming of partisanship, the priming of racial affect, or other kinds of processes, right? Not only that, but when we start to ask about the breadth of framing effects, we also will start to inquire about the elements both of frames and of the individuals hearing those frames or being exposed to those frames that might increase or reduce their breadth. So for instance, it may be that frames that have metaphorical content are going to have broader effects, right? People will recognize the structural similarity between the metaphor and other issues. It may be that those with a significant emotional impact are going to have particularly broad effects, right? That they will activate a wider range of considerations. Maybe also group cues. We know that group cues are a central way in which citizens make sense of the political arena. That too might be a source of the breadth and framing effects. And as I'll try to suggest at the conclusion of the talk, I think studying the breadth of framing effects is not only interesting in helping us make sense of framing, but also indeed making sense of what are the cognitive considerations that tend to be made accessible jointly, and thus this is in some ways a new window into thinking about belief history, right? What are the issues that tend to go together in people's minds? To assess these questions, we're going to use a GFK knowledge panel. I've already acknowledged that time-sharing experiments in social sciences was kind of fun this. We need a large sample size because we're going to be comparing treatment effects across individuals, right? So we have 3,300 respondents, and we also, to do an analysis like this, need dependent variables that measure attitudes on different issues, but using the same scale, using some sort of comparable scale, right? And so we're going to turn to the classic national election study, federal spending items, because we can then make comparisons of the impact of frames across issue areas. We have 25% of our respondents in a control condition. We're just going to be asked in a random order about the 5 issue areas we're interested in. 75% of our respondents are in different treatment arms in which they will read one of the 4 frames. They will answer 2 of the spending questions, then read a second frame, and then from the outstanding 3, and then answer the 3 remaining spending questions. Okay, the goal is to give us a couple different opportunities to measure just how broad or narrow framing effects are. There are 4 frames which I will not have time to go into real depth on. The core point here is that we have frames on terrorism and crime, which are both parallel. They both call attention to, they both argue that given a physical threat, the US needs to be investing more in, needs to sacrifice civil liberties in order to do a better job protecting citizens, right? So these are structurally similar, but they're in distinctive domains. And then there are two frames around government spending, which argue that given the complexity of the real world, the government is going to be ineffective at spending taxpayer money effectively, whether it's in the case of stimulating the economy or intervening to improve healthcare, right? So what you can see here is the fact that we have 4 different frames. We then have a set of opinions that are either directly on that topic. So for instance, if the frame is about terrorism, the question is then about support for anti-terror spending, that are on a proximate topic, a topic that is structurally similar but a distinctive topic, say if the frame is on terrorism then crime, or that are on a quite distinctive topic. So if the frame is on terrorism, then a distinctive topic might be attitudes towards stimulus spending or healthcare spending. We ask people an open-ended question, both to reinforce the frame and to get a sense of how convincing these frames are. 51% of people thought the crime frame was convincing, up to about 67% of our respondents who thought the health frame was convincing. And this shows the within-issue effect. It's worth noting that there is not actually a strong correlation between how convincing the respondents see the frame, thanks, Lily, as being and how dramatically it shifts public opinion. So here what you can see for each of the spending areas is the impact of the within-domain frame, the structurally similar frame, and then the distant frames. And the basic result is that across these issue areas, we also included attitudes on anti-poverty spending, which we didn't frame by any of these, right? What you can see here is that in every case, the largest framing effect is within the issue domain. And through a little bit of statistical work, we can then estimate, we can essentially pool across those results I already showed you, and show here that framing effects are most pronounced on so this shows you the difference in framing effects, right? And the direct frames have a much stronger impact than do even the structurally similar frames, is basically the take home from this, right? The framing effects are largely, not exclusively, but largely confined to that single domain. So by way of conclusion, there is an ongoing and I think really important debate in studies of public opinion about the role of issue positions, right? Should we think of people as having distinctive issue positions? And this research would suggest that indeed there is meaningful issue-specific kind of cognitive architecture that we as citizens use to make sense of and to respond to political frames, right? That the framing effects appear to be strongest within domain, and thus that there is a meaningful distinction between, say, crime and terrorism, even given the structural similarities of those two issues. And I think much more generally, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, what we see then is that it's not just that elite-level politics is structured with respect to discrete issues, but indeed that discrete issues exist in voters' minds, right? That frames on issues, say, of criminal justice are going to influence attitudes towards criminal justice without having a broad impact more generally. So that said, thanks to everybody.